The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping shape it. On today's show, I have Karan Wadhera, who is managing partner of Casa Verde Capital. Casa Verde are a venture capital fund based in the US, focusing on the cannabis industry. Karan, how are you?
I'm good, Anuj. Thanks for having me. I know we've been trying to line this up for a while. I'm glad it finally worked out.
Yeah, no, real pleasure to have you on. Where in the world are you today?
I'm in Los Angeles. I've been moving around a little bit through the pandemic, but it's nice to be back. Things are opening up. People are starting to meet in person. All the things that we've missed in our lives in the last 18 months. So it's we'll see when this airs what the world looks like then. But it does feel like things are starting to get back to the way they used to be. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of excitement around on that front. Cool. Well, look, yeah, as we said, we've been trying to get this on for a while. There's loads to talk about. But as is customary, let's begin a bit about you. And if you could just sort of tell us a bit about your background, what were you doing before, and how and why you decided to get into the cannabis industry?
Yeah. So my background, I think for a lot of folks in cannabis, there is definitely no straight line that leads you here, right? I think all of us have been in different professions, and in some ways, it's that diversity that kind of makes the space so unique. So my background was sort of twofold, two careers really running in parallel. One really traditional in public equities. I joined Goldman Sachs out of school in San Francisco, then Hong Kong, then in India, always on the public equity side and trading. I then joined Nomura when I was in India to help start their India business. And my last role in that world was running Asia ex-Japan trading for them out of Hong Kong. So one half of my life very much, working at big banks, trading desks, and working at sort of equities around the world. And then in parallel, and even predating my time at Goldman, I've always been a pretty active entrepreneur and investor. And so I started my first business in college, which did some work with the music industry, which is how I got to know Los Angeles, which is, where we are right now. And then when I was in Asia, helped start a bunch of different businesses, invested in a lot of different entities and funds as they were forming. So, I was always really passionate on that side of things and wanted the private investment side to be more of what I was doing in life. And so, in 2015, took the plunge, left a comfortable career behind and started exploring different areas where I could, really sink my teeth. And cannabis had all the interesting dynamics of a fascinating industry, right? From obviously the fact that the transition made it, a little nerve-wracking for most folks who were thinking about the industry, which, left a lot of opportunity and space for people who were willing to be a little more adventurous and risk tolerant. And then obviously, the growth and excitement and the number of entrepreneurs that we were seeing move into the space. But where we saw a huge gap and where, I got excited was the fact that there was this lack of institutional capitalists, certainly when we started, that was willing to invest in businesses in the space. And I thought that was a really exciting opportunity. And, that's kind of the origins of where I sort of stepped into the space, in the middle of 2016 and got Casa Verde going.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll talk about the cannabis specific bit in a second, but how different is it, working with public equities to the private investment space? I'm sure there's overlap in terms of how you approach things, but how different is it as well?
Yeah, it's quite different. I'd say one, in the public equities landscape, to some degree, everyone is on the same playing field. You're all dealing with more or less the same amount of information outside of maybe primary research or work you may have done to develop some insights about a certain company or an industry. So I think that's very different, to start with. Whereas in private markets, there's a lot of information arbitrage, right? Things you understand or can perceive, or things you can get to know better, insights you can develop that aren't just available to everyone else, which allow you to make decisions that could give you a real competitive advantage. So I'd say that's like the big macro difference. And then in terms of working in these spaces, I mean, it's completely different, right? Again, it varies from company to company. The kind of information you have, entrepreneurs are wildly different. Their approaches to how to build these organizations are crazy. And then you have all the dynamics of obviously working in cannabis, which just adds a whole new level of complexity to, private markets. But yeah, very, very different. Again, I feel like I had, some edge and advantage in the fact that I had been pretty active as an investor and an entrepreneur before coming into this role. So I at least understood some of those dynamics. And, having done quite a bit of that in India, it was also similar in that, one is an emerging region. Cannabis is an emerging industry, but, have a lot of similar characteristics, especially in terms of, what starts off as a little bit more unsophisticated and quickly becomes like more sophisticated areas, and then start getting more and more attention and things like that. So I think a lot of people see the kind of more institutional background and then moving into cannabis as odd, but I think in reality there's a tremendous amount of overlap.
Yeah, you're craving the messiness of kind of things that aren't fully formed yet, I guess.
Yeah, and and you can see it. It's clear. I've been going to India my entire life. I'm, ethnically Indian, et cetera. But, my parents had moved back to India from the US in 2002, 2003. And my mother was there to help start the India business for Fidelity Investments, like the operational infrastructure, that side of it. And so it was the first time I was going to India with a new lens, and it was just obvious what was happening, right? It was clear. I mean, physically, visually obvious, buildings coming up everywhere, hubs being set up, all these companies going. You could see what was about to happen, and I wanted to be a part of it. And I'd say cannabis has been very similar. As much as there wasn't a lot of capital excited to enter the space in 2014, 2015, it was still felt, at least to me, fairly obvious what was about to happen. And that's why I like timing. Sometimes, you can be too early, and often timing is about, fortuitousness and some element of good luck, right? Which is that, you saw what was about to be, what felt like was a foregone conclusion. And sometimes that can take 5 years, and sometimes that can take 1 or 2 years. And I think when I got into the industry was a really interesting inflection point, because I think things really started to move right after. But, it was probably 20 years in the making.
Yeah, absolutely. But a bold move nonetheless. I mean, did you encounter any stigma coming from a very kind of corporate Wall Street type background? There must have been some odd looks.
For sure. But I think, I'll say this much, Anuj, is that I think we make a lot of assumptions as to what people think without a lot of real data. So what I mean is, when I decided to make the plunge, the one thing I realized that was going to be really critical was I needed to be really vocal about what I was doing. I needed to be very public. I needed everyone that I knew to know what I was doing. One, because it was like this, it was a way to be held accountable, right? It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to dabble in this. I'm not really going to tell anyone. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? That's the way you can sometimes experiment without a lot of implications. But I knew that I wanted to be held accountable, and this is what I wanted to do. So I made it very vocal, very public. I sent an email out to everyone I knew basically in my network, but also because I wanted the assistance. I wanted the help. I wanted the relationship. Who knows, what parts of my network were tapped into the industry in some way, shape, or form. And it turns out there were a lot of people who had a lot of strong beliefs and faith in the cannabis industry, either because they had personal experiences from, a medical perspective, or, were really, had a connection to the plant and cannabis over the years, or whatever the reasons were, or just were really excited about it from an investment side. It was a lot more people in my network that were interested and excited than I had anticipated. And I think that gave me a lot more confidence in kind of the path I was pursuing. But absolutely, was there stigma? For sure. I think it's still lingering, though I think has been reduced quite a bit. But like, these are all anecdotal things I can point to, right? Like, mentioning or, in a conversation that, I work in the cannabis industry a few years ago was like this very novel, potentially eyebrow raising, or, people thought it was funny and laugh and like, oh, tell me more. Like it, whereas now I feel like, at least in the bubbles we're in, and California is definitely a bubble, right? Like it doesn't even raise an eyebrow. It's just met with like an acknowledgement, like, okay, like any other industry that's fast growing. And in LA, especially, right? Like, it's very common to meet someone and they're in film or in television or, in music, and cannabis has just kind of become another one of those categories now, which doesn't necessarily need a ton of explanation after, or isn't necessarily met with like the same amusement it was a few years ago. So yeah, it's changing and it's fun to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're a few years behind you over here in the UK, but it's starting to be a bit more, people are understanding, it's more in the public consciousness, but lots more work to do, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's what's fun. And like, it's great to be at that moment and see that transition. And I think if there wasn't still some stigma, concern, risk, there wouldn't be the kind of opportunity that there is, right? And, when it becomes a foregone conclusion, generally, at least from an investment perspective,
you're too late.
That opportunity is, you're a little late. So, as much as I'm excited for, all the stigma to be removed, it's definitely beneficial while it remains. So in Europe, like you said, you're a few years behind, but I think that still spells out tremendous opportunity for investors.
Absolutely. We hope. Cool. Well, look, let's get on to Casa Verde now. Why don't you tell us a bit about what you do there?
Yeah, so we're a venture fund. We look exclusively at the cannabis space. Historically, a lot of what we have done from an investment perspective has been putting dollars to work in the technology and services and infrastructure surrounding the business. Meaning, we were ancillary focused, not touching the plant. All phrases I'm sure listeners of your podcast are now used to hearing. And yeah, and so, we've raised a fair amount of money. We've put dollars to work in over 20 businesses. We have been fortunate from a performance perspective, our majority of our companies have done very well, raised, substantial follow-on financing. And we've also been, what I like to say, a sort of conduit to a lot of the mainstream institutional capital that's been looking to come into the space. So a lot of the mainstream blue chip kind of funds in the US have put follow-on dollars into some of our businesses, which has been super exciting. Recently, over the last couple of years, we've expanded our scope. So we're no longer limited or restricted to just focusing on ancillary or non-plant touching businesses. But, to that end, I think a lot of our interest is in, some of investing and putting dollars to work in the consumer brands that are going to shape the industry and going to become ubiquitous in their various categories, towards consumers. So yeah, that's the kind of quick overview of who we are and what we do. And, we remain extremely active. And while, again, a lot of the work we've done has been in the US, we have no restrictions as to sort of where we can invest. So we are spending more and more time in Europe as well, and are very bullish about the prospects in the region.
Yeah, fantastic. And I was just going to ask you how many portfolio companies you said around 20. Any of them you want to pick out, the sort of interesting ones that you're doing some cool stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so many. So I'd say a lot of what we, initially, the thesis we had around technology in the space was one of those was really focusing on how do you make it easier for businesses to stay compliant in the cannabis industry. Because of course, in the US, as I'm sure you know, very fragmented space. The rules differ from, county to county, let alone state to state. And, operators, whether you're a cultivator, manufacturer, a distributor, a dispensary in the industry, you have a lot of, regulatory issues you have to deal with all the time. So how can technology help ease some of those burdens? And so that's where a lot of our initial investments were focused around. So we were early investors in a business called Greenbits, which is a point of sale business, not too different from a Square, but again, automated the compliance reporting for dispensaries back into their respective governments. We invested in a business called LeafLink, which is a wholesale marketplace, which allowed brands and retailers to interact in a centralized platform to kind of make that an easy transition. We invested in a business called Dutchy, which is an e-commerce platform that allows retailers to launch delivery, pickup, and online experience. That business became really important in COVID. Going up the chain in compliance, we, led in a growth round into a business called Metric, which is the compliance platform that the governments use to monitor the industry's seed to sale tracking solution. And that has quickly, become the dominant kind of ubiquitous player in the space as well. So a lot of these interesting businesses that help our industry, but also in many ways kind of leapfrog other industries that have had to transition into a tech forward landscape because, in many ways we're a brand new industry, that's transitioning out of an illegal market. We have the ability to begin with all these kind of systems and transparency in place from a supply chain perspective, from a technology perspective. And, there are many things that make our industry really unique. We're large investors in a business called Bespoke Financial, which provides working capital loans to the industry. So whether it's inventory financing, invoice factoring, things of that nature, it's a huge issue because, as you know, most of our businesses in the cannabis industry don't have access to banking. And even if you had access to banking, doesn't mean you have access to kind of, working capital or business loans. And so, you need that creativity and that ability. So, Bespoke in many ways is building out credit in this industry that doesn't really have any of that historical data behind it as well. So it's pretty fun and exciting. I think a lot of our businesses are touching, really interesting, unique parts of the landscape, and they're all, slightly unique to the industry. Another business I highlight is one called Vankst, which is, the leading kind of staffing business for the space. And again, the needs for the industry are really diverse. Some are more traditional, and others are specific, whether it comes to cultivation assets needed at times of, harvesting, trimmers and others that need to come out. And so it's been really fun to watch not only these businesses establish themselves, but pivot and expand their offering as the, industry continues to explode.
Yeah, really interesting what you highlighted there, and very much ancillary, but kind of infrastructure for the industry, and quite a lot of tech solutions there as well. It's almost like, you don't have to start from scratch. You take kind of existing things that work in other sectors, and, they need tweaking and applying to cannabis, but, all of those systems need to be built. And as you say, because you're starting now, you can have the benefit of all the mistakes that other people have done.
Right. I mean, in traditional industry, and I'm sure you've come across this in, historically, what have we seen? We've seen this really frustrating moment of transition when it's like, oh, we need to implement a new enterprise solution. We need to, bring a new CRM. We need to transition our brick and mortar to digital. It's incredibly frustrating transitions, and many companies don't survive that. We have the benefit of no legacy systems, right? I came from traditional institutional finance, and a company like Bloomberg just had a dominant position in our industry, and it wasn't going to be moved because it was so ingrained, right? And it didn't matter even if there were better, cheaper solutions. Imagine trying to transition, 30, 40,000 person businesses off of this platform that's now become ubiquitous to the way you do business. You don't have that challenge, right? So we can build and develop what's going to become, the dominant point of sale cash register for the system, what's going to become, the wholesale platform, the compliance solution. And because there's no legacy systems to battle with, we really are building the infrastructure for the industry. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. We'll get on to the topic of the sort of general investment landscape and get a bit of insight from you there. But it would be remiss of me not to mention Snoop. How does Snoop get involved in Casa Verde?
Yeah. So, dating back to my days pre Goldman Sachs when I was in college, I started my first company, which did digital media consulting for record labels and artists, which is how I first got to know Snoop, his manager, and his team. And so we've known each other and been friends and have done different projects together since. When I was in India, even, I put Snoop in a Bollywood movie, which became like a big movie that year. We produced the song and video, which was also a big hit. He came a few years later and performed. So we always stayed in touch because, Snoop really is this pretty amazing figure who has true global reach, right? In a way that very few people do. And so it's been pretty amazing to see. Next year will be the 30th year anniversary of the Chronic, famous Dr. Dre album where Snoop kind of made his debut to the world. And, he's been a extremely relevant figure for that long. That's very challenging to do in entertainment. And, many of his peers from that era, are obviously have not, maintained that. And so, it's pretty exciting to work with someone like that. And obviously he's been an organic figure as a, whether intentional or not for the cannabis industry as well from the very beginning, right? It's just authentically part of his DNA. Again, the Chronic being the first time we heard of Snoop. And so, towards like the middle of the last decade, Snoop, along with a lot of other influential entertainers, started to be approached to do more in the kind of venture landscape and investing in different businesses. So, whether it's Robinhood or Reddit or Klarna or, the number of others, Snoop was presented with these opportunities to invest early on. So there was this moment, like I said, in 2013, 14, when that was becoming more and more of what he was doing. And at the same time, cannabis legalization really stemming out of Colorado, it became obvious there was going to be an opportunity to do a lot of investing and take a role in this industry as well. So yeah, it's, it was kind of like 15 years in the making of, a friendship and a business relationship. And then all things kind of converged because here I was someone, who obviously knew the team well, who'd been an active investor as well. And, we had a kind of trust and relationship. So it was kind of brought up to me to say like, hey, this is going to be a space I'm going to spend more time in no matter what. And, if you're interested or you see a way or one of these sort of verticals in which you'd like to get involved, would be great to have you. And so I kind of watched the space develop, watched the things they were doing. Snoop helped launch a media business called Mary Jane. He helped launch, one of his own brands with a partnership in Canada and some other jurisdictions in Leafs by Snoop, and also had this, vision for obviously investing as well. And I obviously gravitated to one that made the most sense for me. And in, 2016 kind of came in, took over this business, which had been announced, but not a lot had happened, and kind of took it from there. So, Snoop's involvement and the partnership has been incredibly helpful because obviously he's got such a loud voice and brand. And so it really helped us kind of accelerate our awareness. But, that's not enough, right? That's nice to have, but it's also about performance and raising money, regardless of if you're a well-known, celebrity or not, is very, very difficult. And so we really had to kind of prove ourselves and sometimes, it almost became a higher threshold to prove that, hey, this isn't something that like, it's not some shortcut like, hey, here's a celebrity attached to this. That means, we're going to perform amazingly well. And in fact, I think it's the opposite. You actually haven't seen that turn out well in attempts like that in the venture space. So it was almost a barrier in certain ways to show people that we could actually perform. And so obviously we have, and it's been great. And, he's, very few people in the world who have a very authentic, natural, organic relationship to this industry like Snoop. So, very, very blessed. But I think many people don't know that it's a relationship that started, my God, almost 20 years ago now, which is crazy, as opposed to, again, like a strategically plugging in some figure into what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, look, he's got a long association, and is a great person to have involved. And you're also making me feel really old by saying that the Chronic's going to be 30 years old next year, man. That's I was a teenager when that came out. So
Me too. I remember. Well, I mean, it was a monumental moment. And again, like, I highlight the time only, not to make us feel old, but also to think that all the generations in between have some relationship with Snoop, and all of it's different. I think that's what's fascinating, and that's very difficult to do, right? We kind of knew him at the outset, like as fans of music, but then there's people in between who know him from, the movies he's done, people who know him for, even more recently, collaborations with people like Martha Stewart. I mean, you can't turn the TV on in the US and not see Snoop in these Corona commercials. And he's now has a wine that is, in kind of supermarkets all over the US, and is one of the fastest performing, these kind of, mid-tier wines. It's pretty incredible because, like I said, for most people, that's a challenging position to maintain without being over diluted. But he's been able to do it pretty well, which is, testament to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, cool. As the kind of main topic of the show, to sort of talk a bit more about the investment landscape and maybe give us some advice on how to kind of measure up investment opportunities. Maybe you could just talk a very high level. This could go on forever, so I'm conscious of time. But some of the things that you look for in terms of, deals, and, maybe a couple that are generic and maybe some that are kind of specific.
Yeah. So I think, look, a lot of it depends on like which stage you want to be involved in with a company. We are looking for really high returns, so we tend to be earlier in the maturation of a business, right? So, and when that happens, no matter how solid or exciting the kind of business plan looks, a lot of emphasis has to be placed on the entrepreneur and the kind of core management team. So there's no secret science behind that, right? It means spending time with the person or persons you're going to invest in, really understanding their strengths, understanding their vision, and really making sure they have the grit and patience for what they're about to embark on, right? Almost nothing is a overnight success story, and most great businesses take a long time to develop and mature. So making sure the person, and I would say on the other side of the table, more recently on the other side of the camera, is ready for that journey. That's almost more important because, I think a lot of people, especially in cannabis, were kind of tourists, investors and entrepreneurs alike, which was to say, hey, look at this crazy, huge thing happening. Let's get in, get out, and make a killing. And some were able to, but that's an extremely difficult game, and one that, I came from equities and trading and saw people who attempted that, and I found it very difficult. In many ways, it's much easier to take a very long-term view and be patient. When I say easy, it's not as you can't flip and get out of it and make your money. It's not easy in that way, right? But it's a game of patiently backing really great founders. And even then, a good chunk of those won't work because there are many other factors beyond being an incredible founder to determine the success of a business. But at least you can hedge that quite well when you do, back an incredible founding team. So I think that's where we put a ton of emphasis. And I have plenty of examples where we've maybe relaxed those standards because of the business or the product, and it's caused us pain and heartache. So I would say that's the first part. The second, when you now start digging into the business you're investing in is, does it have the ability to be enduring in the industry? So I think all great businesses have permanent is a terrible word because nothing is necessarily permanent, but have the ability to be a long-term fixture, or the word we like to use is, be ubiquitous in the industry for a certain, obviously the focus where you're putting your attention. So we have a number of those in our portfolio. We've been blessed. These businesses have become, really important to the fabric of the industry. So definitely that's where we put a lot of attention, because I think some businesses don't have the ability, or in a post legalization landscape, let's say for cannabis, may have a lot less relevance. So if they don't have a vision for how that pivots in that time frame or in that landscape, that can be an issue. So, we spent time there as well to understand the kind of enduring value of a business beyond its initial offering. And then valuation price, right? Like that's the final kind of key, which, is really important, because that has to match up as well. And like I said, we are going for generally, large outcomes. That's where we're trying to bet. We're looking for high performing growth businesses. So it does matter kind of where you come in and your entry price. It can affect a lot of things. But again, it's not something we're overly sensitive to if we think the opportunity is massive. But it obviously plays a role.
Yeah, and I think team is obviously, that's one that most investors I've spoke to on the show, highlight as their number one, and it's great to reiterate that. I guess the thing with price, it's probably a balance to be struck as well, right? Obviously, you want to get the best price for you because you're representing, your fund and your investors. But equally, if you beat the other side down too badly, it might now have negative kind of implications as well, right?
For sure. I think, when we're talking about like the 3 boxes that need to be checked, that third one, you would think, maybe is just, if the first 2 are met, then the third one doesn't even matter. It's going to be a great business. You should invest no matter what the price. And unfortunately, that's just not true. And we've seen that again, where things are just priced inappropriately. And to your point, yes, there's a negative side to that too, which is like, if you price it too aggressively, you may lose, the founders may lose motivation there too. So you need to make sure there's enough incentive for those businesses as well. So yeah, for sure. And what we like to do is take minority positions. We always have, take large kind of minority positions in these businesses, because obviously we want the maximum upside to be for the team and the founders.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess one of the other things that factors into this, and it'll be interesting to hear your views on it, forecasts and market size. There are a lot of numbers that get thrown around. They're obviously quite large. I'm not sure whether I believe a lot of them. How do you approach that in terms of forecasts and market size? And one of the reasons I ask is I constantly get asked about this, which ones are believable. Is it quite difficult in this space, given that all of those future looking projections are based on a sort of uncertain track of, legalization or deregulation and all these sort of things? How do you approach that?
Yeah, it is. It's always tricky, and the numbers have a lot of, there's a big delta between the different projections for like the sizing of the market. So yeah, I wish I could tell you. I mean, I think the easiest thing to do is to take a long-term view, because you can have a lot more certainty there, right? And again, I think that's where it makes our job a lot easier. I don't need to be concerned with how big is the US market in 2022 or 2023. We're looking 10 years into the future. And, and I think in many ways, when you do that, you may actually be underestimating the opportunity, because, and this is where it's a lot easier, in my opinion, with cannabis than it is for digital assets, cryptocurrency, blockchain, right? Because with those businesses, we're trying to anticipate a future that doesn't exist, which is, one day we will all use these tokens or currency in this kind of manner. And you may be completely right, but it's unclear, right? And what I look back is early 2000s, when, we had all these kind of grand forecasts for the internet, and on the short term, they were, probably way off. And in the long term, they were like massively underestimated, right? The impact that it's had on everything, e-commerce, et cetera, to the point where like you can't even size that market anymore, right? Like everything is an internet technology business at some degree. So my point is, the difference is with cannabis, like you don't have to do a lot of searching, right? There's a massive existing illegal black market that exists for cannabis and has for the last, 100 years, let alone last 50 years globally. So we actually have a pretty fair understanding to some degree of accuracy of how large the opportunity is, right? And I think that's just for the cannabis space as it exists in its most kind of fundamental core stigmatic way, which is generally like flower and, maybe vaping to some degree. Then looking beyond it as to sort of how more and more consumers will touch the space and all the different form factors, whether it's pharmaceutical, health and wellness, beverages, edibles, etc., is even more compelling. So, sorry, long answer to your question, but I think, the easiest way for us to get comfortable is to have a very long-term view. And I think what you can't predict is this kind of curve of stigma and how quickly that erodes, because I think we've already been seeing it here to the US to some degree. And then the impact is very quick. So, how quickly we've moved to add another 5-6 sort of states to the mix here in the US has been pretty remarkable, because not only is it happening, through referendum at the ballot boxes when people are voting, but now it's just happening in these, state senates and the state Congress through vote and getting approved by, the governor. I mean, New York going from, into legal status happened, fairly quickly. And so you can't necessarily predict, once the tipping point happens, how quickly things come online. So I think my point is it's very difficult and to kind of predict the next year or next 2 years and where market sizing is. But if you can get comfortable with a very long-term view, then it's a lot easier to kind of bake this into your projections.
Yeah, no, I think you highlight a point that we kind of frequently make on the show is to think more long term, and the short term people are hopefully don't stick around for too long in this space. But
yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. And so as we kind of come towards the end, it might just be useful to talk about some of the types of investors that you're seeing in this space, and maybe the difference between institutional investors and the other types of investors. And just to be clear, by institutional investors, are we talking about pension funds and investment banks? Are those the typical people?
Yeah. So I categorize institutional investors as, yes, pension funds, endowments, folks who have like the largest amounts of capital and who are the most frequent funders of private equity and venture capital, and then hedge funds and all these kind of alternative investment classes. They are still largely absent from the space in the US for sure. And what I mean there is absent from, funding funds like ours. There may be a few, but for the most part, they have not been active, and likely because of the current federal standing of the cannabis industry. Much more activity into funds like ours has been from family offices and multifamily offices and high net worth individuals, a lot of which, at least on the family office side, are quite institutional in their organizational structure. So it's, some of these big multifamily offices, have hundreds of people working there, have, really sophisticated investment teams, many who've come from universities and endowments and whatnot. So it's a similar experience, a similar diligence process for folks like us, but is different, right? My friends who have funds in more traditional industries, their process is a lot more streamlined to a few large players who make up the majority of their investor base. That's different for us, and it definitely has been. So that's how I would categorize it, and that's what the landscape has been like, much more for funds like ours. So what does that mean? It means that it's generally a lot harder to raise money. And look, it's gotten easier over time. We have a reputation, we have a brand, people are more comfortable, etc., but it's still not easy by any means. Now, as far as our companies are concerned, the landscape has started changing a little bit. So more mainstream institutional funds have gotten comfortable with investing in the industry. Now, some of those have gotten comfortable with investing in the more ancillary businesses where we focused, right? The technology kind of service businesses that focus on the industry, but are not technically plant touching. And others have gotten even more comfortable and are fine even on the plant touching side. But that's been the big transition that I've seen, right? So when we started, it did not seem plausible that, mainstream venture funds and private equity funds would touch our space. And then, in the last round of Dutchy, for example, you had Dragoneer and Tiger Global and DFJ Growth and, a number of Thrive Capital who've all come into the space and are comfortable. And there are many, many others who were fighting to get into the industry as well. So that's completely different than when we kind of got things started 5 years ago. So the transition is happening, and I would think we're probably, not too far away from the more traditional pension funds and endowments allocating towards our space. when that happens or what that trigger is unclear, but they're certainly doing a lot more exploration than they ever have. So I can tell you in 2016, we weren't having any of those calls. And I can tell you in the last few years, we've been having a lot more of those.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, as things develop? I think last year the Church of England actually said that they would be open to investing in medical cannabis companies. So, if institutions like that are sort of changing how they look at things, it's interesting.
Yeah. And again, the key difference also is I'm talking about the US, and that's very different. Whereas in Europe, where a lot of these businesses are, have licenses from the federal government and they're operating in the, appropriately within the federal infrastructure, that doesn't limit anyone from participating. So I think actually in Europe and around the world, it's a lot different. In Canada, for example, right, there's plenty of institutions who touch the cannabis space because, and touch Canadian companies in that manner because of the kind of federal standing. So that is, a huge difference. And it's very possible that, a US university would invest in whether it's a business or a fund that was focusing specifically in federally legal jurisdictions. I don't think they have any issues there. But obviously the US and businesses focus on the US, which has the largest market opportunity currently, but has this kind of odd, regulatory regime between, the federal government and state governments. People the more traditional folks are still feel restricted from being involved.
Yeah, well, hopefully that changes soon. Cool. Well, thank you, Karan. Thank you for joining us. Really great to chat. We could have talked a lot longer, actually. So I'd love to have you back on at some point, and we can maybe...
Absolutely.
And let's get Snoop on too. That would be fun.
That will be fun. Well, look, I really appreciate it. I think it's great to have platforms like yours to not only educate, but to start to give voice to kind of all the really, truly interesting businesses globally that are developing in our industry. And I think that's, we're operating and investing in, one of the most exciting spaces in the world. And so I think you're in a really exciting position, and thank you for doing what you do. Appreciate it, Anuj.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that too. Thanks, Karan. Well, yeah, good to chat, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
Sounds good.